Crimes of Intellect, Poor Women and Victorian Justice. Written by Alana Sanchez. Narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, stored on electronic devices, or distributed without written permission of the author. Preface. Victorian England produced an enormous literature of crime, but very little of it was written for the women who appear most frequently in its pages. Poor women entered the historical record largely at moments of failure. When a body was discovered, when a child died, when a drawer was opened, when a lie collapsed under questioning. Until then, they existed almost entirely outside notice, unremarked, unprotected, and assumed to be simple. This book begins from the opposite assumption. The women whose lives are examined here were not exceptional because they committed crimes. Crime, in Victorian slums, was common enough. They were exceptional because of the forms their crimes took. Crimes of proximity rather than force. Crimes of patience rather than speed. Crimes built from observation, performance, and an intimate understanding of how respectability worked, and for whom it worked. They were widows, servants, laundresses, caregivers, migrants, and itinerant workers. They lived in lodging houses, basements, back rooms, and borrowed beds. They navigated a city that regarded them as morally suspect, intellectually negligible, and economically expendable. Their labor was poorly paid, their bodies were policed, and their credibility was fragile. When misfortune struck, there were few safe places to fall. What intelligence they possessed was not encouraged. It was tolerated only when invisible. And yet, intelligence was required simply to endure, to find work, to keep a roof, to avoid the workhouse, to read the moods of employers and neighbors, to know when to speak and when silence was safer. For some women, the same skills that allowed survival also made crime possible. For others, those skills made them appear guilty in a system that mistook cleverness for deviance when it appeared in the wrong body. This is not a catalogue of monsters, nor a work of rehabilitation. It is a study of women whose lives collided with Victorian justice and of a legal system that struggled, often unsuccessfully, to interpret female agency without turning it into pathology. The crimes examined here range from murder to fraud, from burglary to conspiracy. Some of the women were guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Others remain ambiguous. In several cases, the evidence is deeply contested, and the verdict rests as much on reputation, class, and gendered expectation as on fact. This book does not resolve every uncertainty. Where the record is unclear, it remains so. What unites these cases is not moral equivalence, but context. Each crime emerges from a landscape shaped by poverty, surveillance, and limited choice. None of these women operated in a vacuum. Their actions were constrained by law, by labor markets, by social scrutiny, and by a legal culture that often decided who they were before deciding what they had done. The reader will encounter explicit material, bodily suffering, domestic intrusion, courtroom humiliation. This is not gratuitous. Victorian courts were explicit when authority required it, and those intrusions form part of the harm inflicted, not only by individuals, but by institutions. To soften that record would be to falsify it. At the same time, this book resists the temptation to turn ingenuity into spectacle. There are no lessons here, no admiration of technique. What appears instead is a record of intelligence exercised under constraint, and of a society unsettled by the discovery that poor women could plan, adapt, deceive, and endure. These women were not disregarded because they lacked intelligence. They were disregarded because acknowledging it would have required a different accounting of power. The chapters that follow do not ask whether these women were good or bad. They ask how Victorian justice recognized female intelligence only when it could be punished for it, and what was lost, distorted, or destroyed in the process. A note on the records. This book relies heavily on Victorian court records, particularly the proceedings of the Old Bailey and related assize courts. These sources are indispensable, and they are not neutral. When reading such material, it is essential to understand what these records are and what they are not. They do not offer a transparent transcript of speech as it was spoken in the courtroom. They are curated summaries, produced after the fact, shaped for print, and filtered through the assumptions of the men who recorded them. The proceedings were written for public consumption. They belonged to a culture in which trials functioned not only as legal determinations, but as public instruction. The reader was meant to learn how crime appeared, how virtue sounded, and how authority responded. What survives on the page reflects those aims. Much of what we read is mediated by male clerks, judges, editors, and lawyers whose understanding of poor women was never impartial. Their expectations about class, intelligence, respectability, emotion, and femininity shaped what they noticed and how they described it. Long testimony could be reduced to a sentence. Explanation could be reframed as excuse. Hesitation could be labeled evasion. There were also limits to what Victorian courts considered fit to print. Sexual, bodily, and domestic details appear inconsistently, sometimes omitted entirely, sometimes described with startling bluntness. The difference was not accuracy, but usefulness. Private life was preserved only until it could be turned into evidence. As a result, several patterns recur throughout the records. Emotion is often underreported unless it serves condemnation. Tears may be mentioned to suggest deceit or hysteria. Composure may be mentioned to suggest coldness. In either case, feeling becomes proof of character rather than a human response. Women's voices are frequently compressed or paraphrased. Their words appear filtered through legal language that alters emphasis and intent. What a woman says and what the record says she said are not always the same thing. And when bodily or domestic detail does appear, it does so most often to justify punishment. Caregiving becomes access. Marriage becomes suspicion. Poverty becomes predisposition. This book treats these records as powerful evidence, not because they are complete, but because they reveal how Victorian justice worked. They show what the court believed mattered, what it believed it could know, and what it believed about women who lived outside comfort and protection. Throughout these pages, the reader will be reminded where the record speaks clearly, where it contradicts itself, and where it falls silent. Certainty will not be imposed where the evidence does not support it. Guilt will not be softened, but neither will it be inflated by prejudice disguised as fact. Victorian courts were capable of extraordinary explicitness when it served authority. This book does not soften that. Where the record intrudes into the body, the home, or the private life of the accused, it will be shown as it was: invasive, moralizing, and often unforgiving. The purpose of this approach is not to rehabilitate reputations or to excuse harm. It is to understand how women whose intelligence was routinely dismissed became legible to the law only when that intelligence was framed as deviance. The court did not describe these women's actions first. Often, it described their faces, their voices, their bearing. Only after their womanhood had been assessed did their crimes become intelligible. That order matters. Part 1. The city that made them. The geography of want. Victorian cities did not merely contain poverty, they organized it. By the middle of the 19th century, London had become a place of astonishing density and unevenness, where wealth and deprivation did not exist at opposite ends of the city, but pressed against one another, sometimes within the same street. Respectable terraces backed onto courts so narrow that daylight barely reached the ground. Cellars were let as dwellings. Attics were divided by lath and paper. In these spaces, privacy was rare, rest was fragile, and survival required constant negotiation. For poor women, the city was not experienced as a map, but as a sequence of thresholds, doorways that admitted or excluded, employers who might dismiss without notice, lodging house keepers who could refuse a bed, pawnbrokers who decided what labor was worth once it had already been performed. Every day required judgment. Every misstep carried consequences. The common lodging house was the most precarious of these thresholds. Licensed or unlicensed, respectable or notorious, such houses functioned as both refuge and trap. Women paid nightly, often in advance, for a bed they did not own and could be removed from at any hour. Some lodging houses were rigidly segregated by sex, others were not. Many imposed curfews. All were crowded. Reputation mattered, but it was unstable, dependent on gossip and the goodwill of proprietors who acted as informal moral arbiters. To sleep indoors was a success. To sleep repeatedly indoors was a skill. Women learned quickly how to remain legible as deserving. They learned how to avoid being mistaken for prostitutes while possessing none of the protections that might have come with that label. They learned when to speak, when silence was safer, and how to appear neither too bold nor too helpless. They learned which landladies tolerated children, which tolerated illness, which demanded references no one could supply. The city required this intelligence constantly. It rarely rewarded it. 2. Women's labor and its disregard. The labor available to poor women was abundant, poorly paid, and assumed to be temporary, even when it lasted a lifetime. Domestic service absorbed vast numbers of girls and young women, particularly migrants from Ireland and the countryside. Service offered food and shelter, but little security. Wages were low. Hours were long. Dismissal could be immediate and without explanation. A servant who lost her place often lost her references as well, and with them her ability to find another. Laundry work, sewing, charring, factory labor, street selling, each carried its own risks. Laundry work ruined hands and health. Needlework destroyed eyesight and paid by the piece. Factory work was regulated unevenly and offered little protection to women who fell ill or pregnant. Street selling brought women into constant contact with police, inspectors, and moral suspicion. What united these forms of labor was not simply exploitation, but disregard. Women's work was treated as natural rather than skilled. It was expected to be done quietly, cheaply, and without complaint. When it failed to sustain life, as it often did, the failure was attributed not to wages or conditions, but to character. This disregard shaped the choices available. A woman who stole from an employer risked arrest. A woman who asked for higher wages risked dismissal. A woman who lied about her history might secure a position. A woman who told the truth might starve. Survival demanded calculation, but calculation was precisely what Victorian morality denied poor women. Intelligence, when exercised openly, was punished as insolence. Intelligence, when exercised covertly, was punished as crime. 3. Surveillance, reputation, and the female body. Poor women lived under near constant observation. Neighbors watched. Landladies watched. Employers watched. Police watched. Charity visitors watched. In courts and lodging houses alike, women were evaluated not only for what they did, but for how they appeared while doing it. Respectability was read off the body: posture, dress, cleanliness, speech. This surveillance was uneven and gendered. Men might be watched for disorder. Women were watched for morality. A woman's movements, companions, and habits were interpreted through assumptions about sexual availability and domestic virtue. To be poor was already to be suspect. To be poor and female was to be permanently explainable as fallen. The result was a profound instability of identity. A woman could be considered respectable in one context and disreputable in another, often on the basis of rumor. Once a reputation shifted, it was almost impossible to recover. The court would later treat that reputation as evidence, citing past suspicion as proof of present guilt. This mattered profoundly when women appeared as defendants. The law did not meet them as unknown quantities. It met them as already interpreted bodies. 4. The court as theater and filter. When poor women entered the courtroom, they did not enter a neutral space. The court was a place where stories were shaped, shortened, and moralist. It was where private lives were translated into legal narratives and where those narratives were made legible to a public audience. The process was not passive. Judges directed testimony. Lawyers framed motives. Clerks summarized speech. Newspapers selected what to repeat. For women accused of crime, especially crimes committed within domestic or caregiving roles, the court often struggled to reconcile evidence with expectation. When the facts did not align with what the court believed women were capable of, explanation gave way to character assessment. Intelligence became artfulness. Planning became cunning. Silence became calculation. The court did not simply determine guilt. It determined meaning. Why these women appear here. The women whose cases form the center of this book did not set out to become historical figures. They appear in the record because something went wrong. A death, a discovery, a betrayal, a pattern that could no longer be ignored. What links them is not a shared moral status, but a shared environment. Each lived in a world that demanded ingenuity while denying its existence. Each navigated institutions that claimed authority while failing to provide security. Each encountered a legal system that struggled to imagine poor women as rational actors except when rationality itself could be framed as a threat. Their crimes, and the accusations against them, cannot be understood without this context. Nor can the ferocity with which Victorian justice responded. What follows is not an argument that poverty excuses harm. It is an argument that harm, intelligence, and judgment were all shaped by a system that refused to see poor women clearly until it was time to punish them. 6. Lodging houses, casual wards, and the price of shelter. For poor women, shelter was never a stable condition. It was a nightly negotiation. The common lodging house occupied a strange position in Victorian urban life. It was regulated, inspected, discussed endlessly in reform literature, and yet it remained one of the most precarious forms of shelter available. Women paid for beds by the night, not the week. Payment was demanded in advance. Illness, lateness, or perceived impropriety could result in immediate expulsion. Privacy did not exist in any meaningful sense. Beds were separated by inches, not walls. Possessions were kept on the body or under the pillow. Conversations were overheard by default. Reputations circulated freely, often detached from fact. A woman's past might follow her from house to house through the quiet networks of landladies and keepers who decided who was safe to admit. To be turned out was not merely inconvenient. It carried consequences that spiraled quickly. A woman without a bed might miss work. A woman who missed work might lose her position. A woman without work or shelter risked the casual ward. The casual ward, the workhouse accommodation for vagrants, was deliberately punitive. Entry required submission to search, separation by sex, and often forced labor in exchange for a single night's shelter. Women were stripped of possessions, examined for cleanliness, and placed under supervision. Mothers were separated from children. Any attempt at dignity was treated as resistance. The system was designed to deter repeat use. In practice, it taught women how to endure humiliation and how to navigate institutions that demanded obedience while offering no security in return. These experiences matter. They trained women in compliance, concealment, and endurance. They taught them how to present the version of themselves that institutions demanded, and how quickly that presentation could fail. 7. Policing, paper, and the invention of the habitual woman. Victorian policing expanded alongside the city, and with it expanded the idea that crime could be tracked. For women, this meant that identity became increasingly fixed on paper. Names, aliases, descriptions, prior convictions, places of birth. These details were collected, copied, and circulated. A woman who moved frequently or used different names did so not necessarily to deceive, but because continuity itself was a luxury. Yet mobility was increasingly framed as suspicion. The label habitual criminal did not describe a type of woman so much as it created one. Once a woman appeared repeatedly in court, her history began to speak louder than the charge before her. Past convictions were treated as predictive. Character evidence bled into legal reasoning. A theft was no longer a theft. It was proof of incorrigibility. A lie was no longer situational. It was a disposition. This paper identity followed women into courtrooms where juries were invited to imagine not a single act, but a pattern. For poor women, especially those charged with property crimes, the future could be decided as much by past appearances as by present evidence. The state was learning to remember them even when it had failed to protect them. 8. Charity, shame, and the economics of deservingness. Alongside the law operated another system of judgment: charity. Victorian philanthropy was extensive, energetic, and conditional. Aid was offered only to those deemed deserving, and deservingness was assessed through moral behavior as much as need. Women seeking help were questioned about husbands, children, habits, sobriety, sexual conduct. Their answers became part of an informal record that could follow them for years. Charity visitors, often middle-class women, entered homes, inspected conditions, and reported impressions. These impressions could influence whether relief was granted, withdrawn, or denied. They could also reappear later as character evidence, recycled through gossip or testimony. For some women, the boundary between charity and surveillance was thin. Accepting help required surrendering privacy. Refusing help risked destitution. In this context, Deception was not an aberration but a rational response to a system that punished honesty when it revealed need without virtue. This economy of deservingness shaped the crimes examined in this book. Fraud, concealment, and misrepresentation often emerged not from greed, but from the necessity of appearing acceptable in a system that equated poverty with moral failure. 9. Knowledge without authority. One of the central tensions running through these cases is the gap between knowledge and authority. Poor women possessed detailed, practical knowledge of households, bodies, illness, labor, markets, neighborhoods, and moods. They knew how long food lasted, how sickness progressed, how employers behaved when displeased, how institutions responded to certain words and silences. What they lacked was the authority to have that knowledge taken seriously. In court, women's explanations were often discounted as self-serving. Their observations were reframed as suspicion. Their intelligence, when visible, was treated as manipulation. The same skills that sustained life outside the courtroom became liabilities inside it. This imbalance matters because it shapes how guilt was interpreted. When a woman acted with foresight, she was framed as scheming. When she acted impulsively, she was framed as irrational. There was little room for complexity. The court preferred archetypes. X, preparing the ground. By the time a woman stood in the dock, much had already been decided. Her class, her gender, her past, her reputation, and her manner all preceded her. The law claimed to judge acts, but it often judged persons. Evidence was filtered through expectation. Silence and speech were both dangerous. Intelligence was both necessary and incriminating. This is the ground on which the following chapters stand. The cases that follow will show how women navigated this world with varying degrees of success and failure. Some used their intelligence to harm. Some used it to survive. Some were undone by the very qualities that had once kept them alive. All of them were judged by a system that struggled to recognize female intelligence except when it could be framed as a threat. Chapter 1. The Widow in the Weeds. She was already being watched before anyone thought to accuse her. This is not because she behaved strangely. It is because widowhood, like poverty, altered the way a woman was seen. A married woman belonged to a man. A widow belonged to no one, and that absence invited scrutiny. When Edwin Bartlett died in a small Pimlico house in the winter of 1886, the question that followed was not what happened, but what kind of woman remained. Adelaide Bartlett was young enough to be pitied and composed enough to make that pity uneasy. She did not perform grief in the way the public expected. She did not collapse. She did not rage. She attended to arrangements, spoke quietly, and accepted assistance with an efficiency that unsettled observers who believed sorrow should be disorderly. Her calm would later be interpreted as calculation. At the time, it was simply noted. The house itself offered little drama. A modest dwelling in a respectable street, neither slum nor sanctuary. It was the kind of place designed to disappear into the city's fabric. Inside, the rhythms of married life had been ordinary. Meals taken together, accounts kept carefully, small domestic disputes smoothed over by habit. There were no signs of violence, no broken furniture, no raised voices overheard by neighbors. Nothing about the marriage announced catastrophe, and yet Edwin Bartlett was dead. Marriage as a closed room. Victorian law revered marriage as a private institution while simultaneously reserving the right to interrogate it. This contradiction would sit at the heart of the case. The Bartlett marriage was unusual, though not scandalous in the ways the court preferred to recognize. Edwin was older, nervous in temperament, physically unwell. Adelaide had been raised in circumstances that offered little stability and even less protection. Their union was shaped by dependency on both sides. He relied on her care. She relied on his provision. That balance was fragile, and it was closely held within the walls of the home. When Edwin fell ill, Adelaide became his primary attendant. She prepared his meals, administered remedies, and managed his comfort. This was unremarkable. Caregiving was expected of wives and rarely acknowledged as labor. It became visible only when something went wrong. The illness progressed quickly. Vomiting, weakness, and distress followed one another with alarming speed. Doctors were summoned. Remedies were tried. Nothing appeared decisive. The symptoms did not align neatly with any single cause, and that uncertainty would later expand into accusation. Edwin died without spectacle. There was no dramatic struggle, no final revelation. His death was quiet, domestic, and contained. It was precisely this containment that troubled those who came after. A death that left no marks demanded interpretation. 2. The body as evidence. In cases where violence leaves no wound, the body must speak for itself. Victorian medicine, particularly in cases of suspected poisoning, operated under significant limitation. Toxicology was emerging but uneven. Tests could fail. Substances could be misidentified or missed entirely. Doctors disagreed openly, sometimes bitterly, about what constituted proof. Edwin Bartlett's postmortem did not deliver certainty. Traces of chloroform were found, but their presence did not resolve how, or by whom, it had been administered. Chloroform was not unknown in respectable households. It was used medically, legally obtained, and widely discussed. Its effects varied with dosage, method, and circumstance. The body offered clues, not answers. This ambiguity mattered. It meant that the court could not rely solely on science. It would have to rely on narrative, and narratives require characters. 3. The performance of mourning. From the moment suspicion surfaced, Adelaide Bartlett's behavior was examined less for what it revealed than for what it failed to perform. Witnesses commented on her manner. She was described as calm, composed, even pleasant. Her voice did not tremble as expected. She spoke clearly. She answered questions without visible distress. To some, this suggested strength. To others, it suggested something colder. The court struggled to articulate what, precisely, was wrong. Instead, it returned again and again to how she appeared. The emphasis shifted subtly but decisively from events to character. Was this the behavior of a grieving wife, or of a woman with something to hide? In Victorian culture, grief was gendered. A woman was expected to display it physically, through tears, collapse, confusion. When Adelaide did not conform, her restraint was reframed as artifice. Emotional control became suspicious not because it was rare, but because it resisted interpretation. This was not evidence in the strict sense. It was atmosphere, and it would prove powerful. 4. What could be proven? The case that followed was less a prosecution than an inquiry into the limits of knowledge. There was no eyewitness to violence, no confession, no clear motive that could not be contested. The medical testimony was divided. The substance in question could not be traced definitively to an act. The home offered no obvious sign of struggle. Marriage itself closed ranks, offering privacy but withholding explanation. The court attempted to reconstruct intimacy from fragments. Meals prepared, medicines administered, conversations recalled imperfectly. Each fragment was weighed not only for content, but for what it suggested about Adelaide Bartlett's mind. Was she attentive or controlling? Was she efficient or calculating? Was she devoted? Or something else entirely? These questions could not be answered by evidence alone. They relied on assumptions about what women were capable of and what kind of intelligence was permissible within marriage. The trial as a test of imagination. The trial that followed became a public exercise in epistemic frustration. How could the law judge a crime that might have occurred entirely within the bounds of accepted domestic behavior? How could it punish an act it could not describe? The courtroom filled with speculation. Newspapers framed the case as a mystery. Commentators seized on the unusual nature of the marriage, the foreignness attributed to Adelaide's origins, the unsettling calm of her demeanor. The absence of certainty became a spectacle in itself. In the end, the court confronted a problem it could not resolve without overreaching. To convict would require believing that a woman's composure and competence were sufficient proof of guilt. To acquit would require admitting that the law could not see into the private space it claimed authority over. The verdict reflected that impasse. Adelaide Bartlett left the court legally innocent and socially marked. The law could not punish her, but it could not forget her either. She remained suspended between suspicion and exoneration, a figure defined less by what she had done than by what she had failed to perform. 6. What this case reveals. The Bartlett case does not offer resolution. That is its significance. It exposes the limits of Victorian justice when confronted with female intelligence exercised within marriage. It shows how quickly the court turned from evidence to interpretation, from facts to faces. It demonstrates how mourning itself could be read as guilt when it did not follow the expected script. Most of all, it reveals a system unsettled by the possibility that a woman might act decisively in private, beyond the reach of witnesses or proof, and that such decisiveness might look indistinguishable from care. The court did not know what happened inside the Bartlett home. It knew only how Adelaide Bartlett appeared when asked to explain it. And that, for a time, was almost enough. 7. Afterlife. Adelaide Bartlett did not disappear after the trial. She simply ceased to be knowable. Acquittal did not restore her to anonymity, nor did it free her from suspicion. The press continued to refer to the case as a mystery, and her name became shorthand for a particular kind of unease. The crime that could not be proven, the woman who could not be read. She was neither condemned nor absolved in the public imagination. She occupied a space between verdict and belief. This liminal status was itself a punishment. Victorian society had little tolerance for ambiguity in women. A woman might be pitted, forgiven, or destroyed, but she was not meant to remain unresolved. Adelaide Bartlett did. She carried the burden of explanation long after the law had relinquished it. In later accounts, she appears flattened into symbol. Sometimes she is presented as a cold schemer, sometimes as a victim of circumstance, sometimes as a cipher onto which anxieties about marriage, female autonomy, and hidden domestic lives are projected. What is lost in these retellings is the ordinariness of her position. A woman whose private life was open to public judgment and then left exposed. The records fall silent where certainty would be most convenient. They tell us what the court could not prove, but not what Adelaide Bartlett thought, feared, or hoped once she stepped outside the courtroom. Like so many women who passed through Victorian justice, she leaves behind a shape rather than a voice. Her afterlife is not one of redemption or disgrace, but of persistence. The case endures because it refuses to settle. It remains a reminder that Victorian courts could be deeply confident in their authority while remaining profoundly unsure of their knowledge, and that women who lived, worked, and cared within the privacy of the home could become legible to the law only when that privacy failed. With this unresolved figure, the book begins. The chapters that follow will not always end in acquittal. Some will end in conviction, imprisonment, or death. Others will end in doubt, but all will return, in different forms, to the same question first posed here. What happens when a system that disregards women's intelligence is forced to confront it? Chapter 2. The Black Widow of the Back Streets. They did not notice her at first because there was nothing to notice. Mary and Cotton moved through the world as thousands of poor women did, marrying, nursing, burying, and starting again. She was not conspicuous. She did not dress oddly, speak flamboyantly, or attract scandal by excess. She appeared, instead, as a woman shaped by misfortune, frequently widowed, repeatedly bereaved, and endlessly unlucky. In a century crowded with death, this did not yet make her remarkable. Children died. Husbands died. Illness moved quickly through cramped houses and lodging rooms. Fever, gastric complaint, exhaustion. These were familiar explanations, offered readily by doctors accustomed to uncertainty and by neighbors who understood how easily a household could collapse. Grief was not proof. Survival was not suspicious. What made Mary and Cotton dangerous was not audacity, but endurance. The economy of death. Victorian England did not merely tolerate death among the poor, it administered it. Burial clubs, insurance schemes, parish relief, and employer death benefits created a modest but real economy around dying. These systems were designed to protect families from sudden expense, not to enrich them. The sums involved were small, carefully calibrated to avoid abuse. And yet, in aggregate, they mattered. They paid rent. They bought food. They prevented the workhouse, sometimes. For a woman who moved from household to household, marriage to marriage, child to child, these systems offered something close to predictability. Forms could be filled out. Claims could be made. Death, when properly documented, became legible to institutions that otherwise ignored the living. Mary and Cotton learned this language fluently. She did not invent the system. She used it as it existed, quietly, repeatedly, and without flourish. Each death generated paperwork. Each payment closed a gap. None were large enough to alarm. None were so immediate as to invite scrutiny. The rhythm was slow, administrative, and, at first, entirely unremarkable. 2. Domestic intimacy as opportunity. Unlike crimes of force or speed, poisoning requires proximity. It requires meals prepared, medicines administered, hands trusted. It requires the kind of access granted almost automatically to wives and mothers. In this sense, Mary and Cotton's crimes were not transgressions of domesticity, but distortions of it. She acted within the role expected of her, using its privileges and protections. The illnesses followed familiar patterns: vomiting, weakness, decline. Doctors were called. Remedies were prescribed. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes they did not. When death came, it came without spectacle. There were no wounds to explain, no struggle to narrate. In court records, these deaths are often described tersely. A child took ill. A husband lingered. A body was buried. What is striking is not the violence of the acts, but their administrative neatness. Life moved on. Another household formed. Another set of obligations emerged. Mary and Cotton did not appear to flee death. She remained present, composed, and capable. This steadiness would later be framed as callousness. At the time, it was simply survival. 3. Rumor, repetition, and the slow awakening of suspicion. What finally disturbed the equilibrium was not a single death, but accumulation. Neighbors began to notice patterns, not immediately and not unanimously. The poor are accustomed to misfortune, and it takes time for coincidence to harden into suspicion. But repetition has a way of sharpening attention. Too many funerals, too many claims, too many households left empty. Whispers circulated before accusations did. Women spoke to one another in kitchens and yards. Landladies exchanged glances. Doctors compared notes. None of this appeared in official records at first. It lived in the informal spaces where women's knowledge circulated without authority. The institutions lagged behind the rumors. Insurance offices processed claims. Registrars issued certificates. The system continued to function as designed until it no longer could. When suspicion finally entered the formal record, it did so awkwardly. The law was unprepared to confront a crime that looked like care, and a perpetrator who looked like a grieving woman. 4. The court confronts repetition. Mary and Cotton's trial forced the court to do something it disliked. Consider pattern as evidence. 1 death could be dismissed. 2 could be unfortunate. 3 might raise eyebrows. But the accumulation required interpretation. The court began to construct a narrative retrospectively, aligning deaths that had once been isolated events into a single, coherent story. This process was both powerful and dangerous. On one hand, it allowed the court to see what had previously been invisible: the structural use of domestic access, the administrative exploitation of death benefits, the quiet regularity of harm. On the other hand, it risked turning every misfortune into proof, every illness into suspicion. Medical testimony was once again divided, but less forgiving than in the Bartlett case. Arsenic could be identified with greater confidence than chloroform, though uncertainty remained. The body spoke more clearly, but not unequivocally. What tipped the balance was not science alone. It was context. The court weighed Mary and Cotton's composure, her remarriages, her movements, her claims. Her intelligence, once invisible, was now reframed as calculation. The very endurance that had sustained her became evidence against her. Judgment and meaning. Unlike Adelaide Bartlett, Mary and Cotton was not protected by ambiguity. The court reached for certainty and found it acceptable. The verdict reflected not only the evidence presented, but the relief of resolution. Here was a crime the law could name, a woman it could condemn without hesitation. Mary and Cotton was sentenced to death. The punishment was definitive. The story, however, was not. 6. What this case reveals. The Cotton case demonstrates how long a woman could operate within domestic expectations before becoming legible to the law, and how violently that legibility could arrive. It reveals a system willing to tolerate repeated death so long as it could be explained as misfortune, and then willing to reframe that misfortune as monstrosity once explanation failed. It shows how bureaucracy can obscure harm even as it records it meticulously. Most of all, it exposes a grim paradox. Mary Ann Cotton was able to act not because she was invisible, but because she was recognizable. She fit the role assigned to her too well to be questioned early, and too poorly to be forgiven once questioned at all. Her intelligence was never in doubt once the trial began. What was in doubt was whether such intelligence could be imagined as anything other than evil when exercised by a poor woman in the most intimate of spaces. 7. Afterlife. Mary Ann Cotton's death did not conclude her story, it fixed it. In the years that followed, her name became shorthand for a particular Victorian fear: the woman who kills from within the home. She was folded quickly into popular literature, journalism, and later true crime retellings as a figure of excess, an aberration, a monster, a warning. The complexity of her circumstances was stripped away in favor of moral clarity. Unlike Adelaide Bartlett, Mary Ann Cotton was not permitted ambiguity. Certainty became her legacy, even where the historical record is less complete than later accounts suggest. Each death attributed to her was absorbed into a single narrative of depravity, leaving little room to examine how long institutions had failed to notice, intervene, or question. In popular memory, she is often presented as an outlier. In reality, she reveals something more troubling: how easily violence could hide inside ordinary domestic life, and how reluctant Victorian society was to interrogate that space until repetition made silence impossible. Her afterlife is instructive not because it resolves doubt, but because it eliminates it. The system that once ignored her intelligence repurposed it after her death as proof of monstrosity. In doing so, it avoided harder questions about poverty, gender, and the structures that made such crimes possible. Mary Ann Cotton remains one of the few women in this book whose guilt is rarely contested. That certainty, too, deserves examination. It comforts the reader. It reassures the system. And it risks obscuring the conditions that allowed her to operate for so long, unseen and unremarkable, in full view of a society accustomed to women bearing death quietly. Chapter 3. The Maid Who Became the Mistress. She knew the house better than anyone who owned it. Kate Webster arrived in London as many women did. Poor, Irish, and unprotected by reputation. Domestic service offered food, shelter, and the promise, often false, of stability. It also offered something else: proximity. Servants lived inside the private lives of their employers. They learned habits, voices, routines, weaknesses. They learned which doors locked, which did not, and how authority sounded when it was tired. Kate Webster did not drift into crime. She collided with it. When Julia Martha Thomas hired her as a servant, the arrangement carried the usual asymmetries. Mrs. Thomas was respectable, middle-aged, financially independent, and exacting. Webster was younger, volatile, frequently dismissed from previous positions, and keenly aware of her own precarity. The household was not abusive in any extraordinary sense. It was rigid, watchful, and intolerant of defiance. The conflict between them was not immediate, but it was structural. One woman owned the space. The other inhabited it conditionally. Domestic service as total surveillance. Domestic service placed women under constant scrutiny. Servants were observed not only in their labor, but in their posture, speech, temper, and obedience. Employers claimed authority over time, movement, and conduct. A servant's room, if she had one, was often subject to inspection. Privacy existed only by permission. Kate Webster was ill-suited to this environment. Contemporary descriptions emphasize her temper, her resistance to correction, her unwillingness to submit. These traits were framed as personal failings. They were also survival strategies in a labor system that punished passivity as readily as insolence. Dismissal hovered constantly, and dismissal carried consequences far beyond the loss of wages. Without a reference, a servant could find herself locked out of future employment. Without employment, the city closed quickly. In this sense, domestic service trained women in acute observational skill. It taught them how authority functioned within the household, and how fragile it could be when isolated. 2. Violence without witness. The murder of Julia Martha Thomas did not erupt publicly. It occurred inside the house, beyond the reach of immediate witnesses. The violence itself was sudden, intimate, and excessive. A quarrel escalated. A blow was struck. What followed was not flight, but occupation. Kate Webster did not run from the house. She stayed. This decision would define the case. Rather than conceal the crime through disappearance, Webster attempted something more audacious. She assumed the identity of the woman she had killed. She wore Mrs. Thomas's clothes. She answered the door. She spoke to tradesmen and neighbors. She signed receipts. For a brief period, she inhabited the role that had governed her. This impersonation relied on class assumptions. Few people looked closely. Fewer still imagined that a servant might convincingly occupy the position of her employer. Respectability functioned as camouflage. Authority was recognized because it was expected. The deception was imperfect, but it lasted long enough to reveal something unsettling. How thin the boundary was between servant and mistress once clothing, address, and confidence aligned. 3. Discovery and shock. The unraveling was swift once it began. Inconsistencies accumulated. Behavior did not quite match expectation. Neighbors grew uneasy. The body, hidden and dismembered, was eventually discovered. The domestic space that had concealed the crime became the site of its exposure. The public reaction was visceral. The case offended on multiple levels: murder, deception, class trespass, and bodily violation. The idea that a servant could kill her employer and then become her, even briefly, provoked particular horror. It suggested not only violence, but social instability. Kate Webster did not deny the killing. She admitted it with a frankness that unsettled observers accustomed to either silence or pleading. Her candor was interpreted as further evidence of depravity. Once again, composure was read as monstrosity. 4. The court and the limits of forgiveness. The trial was swift and unforgiving. Unlike the Bartlett case, there was no ambiguity to protect the accused. Unlike the Cotton case, there was no need to establish pattern. The evidence was immediate, physical, and overwhelming. The body spoke clearly. What interested the court, however, was not only the act of murder, but the impersonation that followed. This was treated as an aggravation, a violation not merely of law but of social order. The crime was framed as an inversion. The servant who usurped the mistress, the dependent who briefly ruled. The language used in court reflected this anxiety. Webster was described as brutal, unfeminine, and degraded. Her intelligence was acknowledged only to condemn it. Planning became cunning. Presence of mind became coldness. There was no appetite for explanation. Rage, desperation, and structural confinement were irrelevant once the boundary had been crossed so completely. The sentence was death. V. Punishment and spectacle. Kate Webster was executed publicly. Her execution drew a large crowd. The spectacle served its purpose: to reassure the public that the boundary she had violated would be restored with finality. The servant who dared to occupy the mistress's place was erased. The law reasserted itself not only through punishment, but through symbolism. Order was restored. The house returned to silence. The transgression was sealed. 6. What this case reveals. The Webster case exposes the volatility of domestic service as a system built on proximity and control. It shows how intimacy without power can curdle into violence, and how quickly that violence is framed as individual depravity rather than structural failure. It reveals the terror Victorian society felt when class hierarchy appeared permeable, when roles could be assumed rather than inherited. Kate Webster's intelligence is undeniable in this case. It is also unforgivable. Unlike Adelaide Bartlett's composure or Mary and Cotton's endurance, Webster's cleverness was visible, performative, and transgressive. It did not hide within care or bureaucracy. It walked openly into the parlor and answered the door. That, more than the murder itself, made the case intolerable. 7. Afterlife. Kate Webster's afterlife was swift and brutal. She entered popular memory as a figure of horror, the servant who murdered her mistress and wore her clothes. The details of the case were repeated endlessly, often stripped of context and inflated for effect. Her Irishness, her temper, and her supposed moral depravity were emphasized as explanatory rather than incidental. In later retellings, she is rarely afforded complexity. She is not ambiguous like Adelaide Bartlett, nor administratively unsettling like Mary and Cotton. She is offered instead as a moral absolute, a warning about class disorder and female rage. What is lost in this retelling is the system that placed women like Webster in positions of total dependence, without recourse. Domestic service appears as background rather than pressure. Surveillance appears as order rather than provocation. Her afterlife reassures because it simplifies. It allows Victorian society and later audiences to believe that such violence erupted from individual wickedness alone, rather than from a labor system that demanded obedience without security and intimacy without dignity. Kate Webster does not linger as a mystery. She endures as a boundary marker. Her story insists that some forms of intelligence, particularly those that expose how easily authority can be imitated, will never be tolerated. Chapter 4: Sally Arsenic. She was known long before she was accused. Sarah Chesham lived in a village that believed it understood her. She was poor, outspoken, frequently pregnant, often ill, and persistently present in other people's lives. She borrowed. She argued. She survived. In a rural economy already strained by poverty and proximity, this made her visible, and visibility, for a woman like Chesham, was never neutral. By the time the name Sally Arsenic began to circulate, it did not function as an accusation so much as a conclusion. The deaths came first. The story followed. Poverty without privacy. Unlike the women whose crimes unfolded in cities, Sarah Chesham lived in a world without anonymity. Village life offered proximity without refuge. Neighbors watched one another closely, not out of malice alone, but necessity. Resources were shared, borrowed, withheld. Reputation mattered intensely because it traveled quickly and had nowhere to dissipate. A woman known to be difficult, quarrelsome, or needy could not retreat into obscurity. Chesham's life was marked by hardship. She bore multiple children, many of whom did not survive infancy. Illness was frequent. Poverty was chronic. She relied on neighbors for assistance and quarreled with them when assistance came with conditions. She was neither docile nor grateful enough to reassure those around her. This mattered. Victorian suspicion did not require secrecy. It required discomfort. 2. Death in familiar forms. The deaths attributed to Sarah Chesham did not initially stand out. Children sickened and died. Infants failed to thrive. Illness moved through bodies already weakened by hunger and overcrowding. Doctors recorded symptoms that could belong to many causes. Vomiting, wasting, convulsions. These were not unknown in poor households. The line between disease and poisoning was not yet clear, either medically or culturally. What distinguished these deaths, in retrospect, was their concentration. When patterns began to be discussed, they were discussed informally. Women spoke to one another. Complaints were voiced. Fears circulated. None of this carried legal authority, but it created an atmosphere in which interpretation hardened quickly. Arsenic, by mid-century, had entered popular imagination as both poison and explanation. It was accessible. It was feared. It provided a language for suspicion when certainty was absent. 3. The making of a reputation. Sarah Chesham's reputation did not arise solely from the deaths. It arose from how she moved through the village. She argued openly. She resisted moral instruction. She did not perform gratitude convincingly. She did not appear properly subdued by loss. These traits were recorded not as personality, but as character evidence once suspicion attached. In this context, behavior became retroactive proof. Past quarrels were reinterpreted as motive. Ill feeling became intent. Poverty itself was reframed as predisposition. Chesham was not accused because she was invisible. She was accused because she was already known. The village had little difficulty imagining her capable of harm. The difficulty lay in proving it. 4. The court meets the village. When the case reached formal proceedings, it carried the weight of accumulated suspicion. Medical testimony was uncertain. Arsenic was alleged, but evidence was inconsistent. Post-mortems were limited. Records were incomplete. Doctors disagreed. The science did not settle the matter cleanly. What entered the courtroom alongside medical evidence was village knowledge, rumor, recollection, character assessment. Neighbors testified to arguments, threats, and past behavior. These accounts were treated with caution and yet given space. filling gaps where certainty failed. The court was forced to choose between competing forms of knowledge. On one side stood imperfect science. On the other stood social consensus. Neither was reliable. Together, they were persuasive. Conviction without closure. Sarah Chesham was convicted and sentenced to death. The verdict provided resolution where evidence had not. It satisfied the village's need for explanation and the court's need for authority. A dangerous woman had been identified, named, and removed. But the case did not settle easily. Doubts persisted almost immediately. Questions were raised about the medical evidence, the reliability of testimony, and the extent to which prejudice had shaped interpretation. Public discomfort grew. The execution did not proceed as planned. Her sentence was eventually commuted. This hesitation is important. It marks a moment when Victorian justice faltered, not because it discovered certainty, but because it recognized unease. 6. What this case reveals. The Chesham case reveals how easily poverty, personality, and grief could be transformed into guilt. It shows how communities under strain seek coherence through blame, and how courts sometimes accept social consensus as a substitute for proof. It exposes the fragility of forensic authority in a period eager for scientific explanation but ill-equipped to provide it. Most importantly, it demonstrates how women who did not perform submission convincingly were vulnerable to being reinterpreted as dangerous. Sarah Chesham's intelligence, such as it was, lay not in deception but in resistance. She did not conceal herself well enough to be safe. In this case, cleverness was not criminal ingenuity. It was survival without compliance, and that, too, could be punished. 7. Afterlife. Sarah Chesham's afterlife was shaped by doubt. She did not become a legend in the way Mary and Cotton did, nor a moral boundary marker like Kate Webster. Instead, she lingered as an uncomfortable question. Was she guilty? Was she scapegoated? Did the village mistake hardship for malice? Later accounts struggle to settle on a single answer. Some frame her as a poisoner spared only by technical mercy. Others treat her as a victim of hysteria, class prejudice, and inadequate science. The records themselves refuse resolution. What endures is the pattern. Chesham's case illustrates how easily suspicion can crystallize around women who are poor, visible, and insufficiently deferential, and how difficult it is to dismantle that suspicion once it acquires a name. Her story warns against certainty achieved too quickly. It reminds us that Victorian justice could act decisively even when knowledge was partial, and that mercy, when it came, often arrived not as vindication but as discomfort. Sarah Chesham does not haunt this book as a monster. She haunts it as a possibility, that cleverness, resilience, and refusal could be mistaken for threat in a system eager to find one. Chapter 5. The Nurse of Quiet Rooms. She was welcomed because she was useful. Catherine Wilson entered households at moments of vulnerability. Illness created need. Need created trust. Nursing work, formal or informal, gave women sanctioned access to bodies, medicines, meals, and routines. It was labor that required proximity and discretion, and it was rarely supervised closely. When it functioned well, it disappeared into relief. When it failed, it did so quietly. Wilson's work took place in rooms already accustomed to suffering. The sick room was not a place of scrutiny, but of endurance. Visitors came and went. Doctors appeared intermittently. Family members were exhausted. Responsibility concentrated in the hands of the woman who remained. This concentration of trust would prove decisive. Care as access. Victorian caregiving rested on assumptions rather than safeguards. Nurses were expected to be patient, obedient, and invisible. Their competence was judged by demeanor rather than training. They administered food, drink, and medicine with minimal oversight, particularly in working-class homes where medical visits were infrequent and records sparse. Catherine Wilson's presence did not disrupt these expectations. She appeared capable and attentive. She knew how to behave in sick rooms, when to speak, when to move quietly, when to reassure. Her labor blended into the rhythm of care. This invisibility was not accidental. It was structural. The work was feminized, undervalued, and poorly regulated. When deaths occurred, they were attributed to illness rather than intervention. Care was assumed to be benevolent by default. Wilson did not need to invent access. It was given. 2. The shape of the deaths. The deaths associated with Catherine Wilson were not immediately alarming. They followed patterns familiar to anyone accustomed to sickness. Gradual decline, worsening symptoms, final collapse. Vomiting, weakness, and distress appeared, but such signs were common in untreated or poorly treated illness. When death came, it was rarely sudden. It looked like failure rather than violence. What distinguished these cases, in retrospect, was not spectacle but proximity. Wilson was present repeatedly. She remained in attendance as conditions worsened. She did not flee or conceal herself. She continued to work. This consistency delayed suspicion. Stability was reassuring. It suggested duty rather than danger. 3. Recognition after the fact. Suspicion emerged unevenly and late. Concerns were raised only after patterns were discussed across households. Individual families struggled to articulate unease. Collectively, those misgivings accumulated. The question was not what Wilson did in any single sick room, but why illness seemed to follow her employment. As with other poisoning cases, medical evidence proved uncertain. Arsenic was suspected, but identification was inconsistent. Symptoms overlapped with common diseases. The science did not speak clearly enough to override doubt on its own. What shifted perception was narrative. The court and press reconstructed events backwards, aligning deaths into a sequence that could be interpreted as intent. The nurse who stayed became the nurse who lingered. Presence was reframed as opportunity. 4. Trust on trial. When Catherine Wilson was brought before the court, the focus was less on method than on betrayal. The crime was framed not merely as murder, but as a violation of role. Nursing carried moral weight. To abuse it was to threaten the social fabric that allowed care to function at all. The idea that a woman entrusted with the sick could exploit that trust provoked deep anxiety. Testimony lingered on domestic detail. Meals prepared, medicines given, moments when Wilson was alone with the patient. These details were not remarkable until recast as evidence. Routine acts became suspicious in retrospect. Wilson's demeanor was scrutinized closely. Calmness was read as indifference. Familiarity with sickness was reframed as callousness. Her knowledge, once valued, became incriminating. The court sought to make sense of intimacy turned lethal. It did so by transforming trust into proof. Conviction and certainty. Catherine Wilson was convicted and sentenced to death. The verdict reflected a desire for clarity. Here was a crime that could be named without ambiguity. The caregiver who kills. The court could condemn her decisively, restoring moral order to the sick room. Execution followed. Unlike the Bartlett or Chesham cases, there was little hesitation. The threat Wilson represented was too destabilizing to leave unresolved. Care itself had been compromised. The punishment was intended to reassure as much as to deter. 6. What this case reveals. The Wilson case exposes the vulnerability built into systems of care that rely on trust without oversight. It shows how women's labor could be both essential and unexamined, and how invisibility functioned as both protection and danger. It demonstrates how caregiving, assumed to be morally neutral or virtuous, became terrifying once its potential for harm was acknowledged. Catherine Wilson's intelligence lay in her ability to operate within expectations. She did not disrupt routines or attract attention. She worked as she was supposed to. That competence delayed scrutiny and, ultimately, magnified the shock of discovery. Once exposed, however, her intelligence was treated as perversion. Knowledge of illness became evidence of intent. Familiarity became menace. 7. Afterlife. Catherine Wilson's afterlife is quieter than that of other women in this book. She did not become a household name or a cultural symbol. Her case circulated primarily as a warning within medical and charitable discourse, a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong woman in the sick room. Nursing reformers cited her as evidence of the need for regulation and moral screening. In popular memory, she appears briefly and grimly, a figure who unsettles because she does not fit easily into familiar categories. She was neither wife nor mother in these narratives, neither neighbor nor servant. She occupied a role defined by care and corrupted it. What is often lost is the context that made such corruption possible. Care work was underpaid, undervalued, and loosely supervised. Responsibility was immense, accountability was not. Wilson's crimes were individual, but the conditions that enabled them were systemic. Her afterlife serves a specific purpose. It reassures by isolating the threat. It suggests that danger resided in a single woman, rather than in a system that entrusted life to labor it refused to see. Catherine Wilson does not linger as a mystery. She lingers as a warning about trust extended without protection, and about the cost of assuming that women's care is always benign. Chapter 6. Beautiful Forever. She did not sell lies. She sold possibility. Madame Rachel, born Sarah Rachel Russell, understood something fundamental about Victorian womanhood. That appearance was not vanity, but currency. Respectability could be purchased, enhanced, repaired. Youth, refinement, and social acceptability were not merely personal desires. They were protections in a society that measured women relentlessly and forgave them rarely. Madame Rachel did not operate in the slums, but she relied on them. Her business existed because women feared falling into them. Aspiration as a market. By the mid-19th century, London had become a city obsessed with surfaces. Industrialization brought new wealth, new classes, and new anxieties about visibility. Women were judged on youth, complexion, posture, and polish. Marriage prospects, employment, and social standing all hinged on presentation. To age poorly, to appear worn, was to risk social disappearance. Madame Rachel identified a gap between what women were expected to be and what life allowed them to remain. Into that gap, she inserted a promise: restoration. Her salon offered treatments, advice, and products framed not as cosmetics, but as transformation. She spoke the language of discretion and exclusivity. Clients were reassured that their visits would remain private, their vulnerabilities protected. The service was not merely beautification. It was containment of shame. This mattered. Shame silences complaint. 2. Respectability as camouflage. Madame Rachel's success depended on credibility. She cultivated an image of refinement, expertise, and moral seriousness. Her business was framed as scientific, proprietary, and exclusive. The very opacity of her methods became a selling point. Clients were not purchasing products. They were purchasing trust. The women who sought her services were often respectable, married, and anxious. Many had means. They were not reckless consumers. They were cautious women attempting to preserve social position in a culture that punished aging and imperfection harshly. When payments escalated, they were framed as investments. When results disappointed, explanations were offered patiently. The language of gradual improvement replaced immediate proof. Hope was extended, deferred, renewed. Madame Rachel understood how long hope could last when embarrassment prevented scrutiny. 3. The law encounters female fraud. Fraud cases unsettled Victorian courts in particular ways. Unlike theft or violence, fraud relied on consent, however compromised, and trust. In Madame Rachel's case, the victims were not impoverished or powerless in the conventional sense. They were women whose social standing depended on silence. To accuse her publicly was to admit vulnerability. This dynamic delayed intervention. Complaints were slow, fragmented, and reluctant. It took time for individual dissatisfaction to coalesce into legal action. When the case reached court, the challenge was not proving deception but narrating it without humiliating the victims. Testimony had to be explicit enough to establish fraud, yet discreet enough to preserve respectability. The court walked this line awkwardly. 4. Trial and exposure. Madame Rachel's trial was marked by a tension between fascination and disdain. The court examined contracts, receipts, promises, and payments. Witnesses described treatments that failed to deliver the promised results. The language remained careful, even coy. What was not said was often as important as what was. Madame Rachel herself appeared composed and articulate. Her intelligence was visible, and it alarmed the court. She defended her business practices as legitimate, her promises as misunderstood, her methods as proprietary. This defense did not persuade. The court reframed her sophistication as manipulation. The narrative hardened quickly. She was no longer an entrepreneur exploiting a gap in the market, but a swindler preying on vanity. The verdict was conviction. The sentence was imprisonment. Punishment without spectacle. Unlike other women in this book, Madame Rachel was not executed. Her punishment was deliberately untheatrical. Imprisonment removed her from circulation without elevating her to martyr or monster. The state dismantled her business quietly, reclaiming authority over a sphere it had previously ignored. This restraint was instructive. Madame Rachel had threatened not life, but credibility. Her crime embarrassed the respectable as much as it harmed them. Excessive punishment would have drawn attention to the very vulnerabilities the court preferred to keep discreet. Justice, in this case, aimed to restore decorum. 6. What this case reveals. Madame Rachel's case reveals how female intelligence could be tolerated so long as it remained decorative. Her crime lay not in invention, but in translation. She translated social fear into profit, insecurity into demand. She understood the economy of appearance with precision and exploited it without apology. What unsettled Victorian justice was not merely the fraud, but the mirror it held up. The court was forced to confront the fact that women were being judged, and judging themselves, according to standards that made such schemes plausible. Madame Rachel's intelligence was undeniable. It was also unacceptable once it disrupted the moral fiction that respectable women were immune to deception. 7. Afterlife. Madame Rachel's afterlife is one of reduction. She appears in later accounts as a charlatan, a curiosity, a cautionary tale about vanity and gullibility. The broader context of her success is often ignored. The desperation that drove women to her door is reframed as foolishness. The social pressures that sustained her business disappear. Her name becomes shorthand for fraud without inviting examination of why the fraud worked. What remains unexamined is how carefully she operated within the limits imposed on women's enterprise. She built a business in a world that offered few legitimate avenues for female entrepreneurship, especially for women without inherited status. When she exceeded those limits too visibly, the law intervened. Madame Rachel does not haunt this book as a murderer or a mystery. She haunts it as a reflection of a culture that demanded impossible standards of women, then punished those who offered a way to meet them, however illusory. Her story marks a shift in this book's trajectory. From this point on, the crimes become less solitary and more collective, less intimate and more organized. The intelligence on display moves from private manipulation to shared labor. Chapter 7. The Burglary Laundress. She carried other people's dirt for a living. Lydia Lloyd worked in a trade that required physical strength, endurance, and a tolerance for intimacy without recognition. Laundry labor was among the most exhausting forms of women's work in Victorian cities. It ruined hands, backs, and lungs. It paid by the piece. It offered no security beyond the next bundle of clothes. It also offered movement. Laundresses moved between households, neighborhoods, and social worlds. They entered homes regularly, learned routines, observed habits, and handled possessions without attracting attention. Their presence was ordinary enough to be invisible. Their knowledge was practical and detailed. For some women, that knowledge became leverage. Work that leaves no trace. Laundry work left little documentary evidence. Unlike factory labor or domestic service, it did not produce contracts, references, or stable addresses. Laundresses were paid in cash. They worked where demand arose. They disappeared easily when work dried up. This instability created vulnerability. It also created opportunity. A woman who moved frequently was difficult to trace. A woman without a fixed employer could not easily be dismissed or reported. The very informality that made laundry work precarious also made it flexible. For Lydia Lloyd, flexibility became survival. 2. Property crimes and female mobility. Burglary was not considered a woman's crime in the Victorian imagination, and this assumption shaped both opportunity and response. Women were searched less rigorously. Their movements attracted less suspicion. When arrested, they were often treated as accomplices rather than principals. These assumptions did not protect women from punishment once convicted, but they delayed attention. Lloyd's crimes were not flamboyant. They relied on timing, familiarity, and access rather than force. Houses were entered quietly. Property was removed selectively. Nothing announced the crime until absence was discovered. Her work background mattered. She knew which homes were empty during washing days, which doors were left unsecured, which valuables were handled casually. She knew how long it took for suspicion to surface. This knowledge did not make her invulnerable. It made her effective, temporarily. 3. The net tightens. What ultimately constrained Lydia Lloyd was not a single mistake, but accumulation. Victorian policing increasingly relied on record-keeping. Names, aliases, descriptions, and prior convictions began to travel faster than women could. A mobile life that once offered safety became legible as pattern. Once Lloyd appeared repeatedly in court, she ceased to be treated as an isolated offender. She became a type. The habitual woman. Her history entered proceedings before she did. Past offenses were invoked to explain present ones. This shift mattered. It altered how evidence was interpreted and how punishment was calibrated. Burglary committed by a first-time offender invited correction. Burglary committed by a woman with a record invited containment. The law learned how to remember her. 4. Courtroom translation. In court, Lloyd's work history was reframed. Her mobility became vagrancy. Her adaptability became deceit. Her resilience became incorrigibility. The practical intelligence required to sustain an informal trade was translated into criminal propensity. Testimony focused on patterns rather than particulars. The narrative hardened. Context fell away. This translation was efficient. It allowed the court to bypass questions about labor, poverty, and gendered opportunity. Lloyd was no longer a woman navigating instability. She was a criminal identity that needed managing. Punishment as containment. Sentencing reflected this shift in perception. Imprisonment was no longer simply punitive. It was preventative. Removing Lloyd from circulation was framed as a public good. The possibility of reform receded as the priority became control. The sentence closed space. It limited movement. It answered mobility with enclosure. For a woman whose survival depended on motion, this was decisive. 6. What this case reveals. The Lloyd case reveals how quickly Victorian justice moved from judgment of acts to management of persons. It shows how informal labor, when combined with crime, became indistinguishable from deviance in the eyes of the court. The very qualities that allowed women to survive without institutional support, flexibility, movement, reinvention, were reclassified as threats once they intersected with illegality. Lydia Lloyd's intelligence lay in her ability to navigate a city that offered no stable foothold. Once that navigation was reframed as criminal, there was little room left for explanation. 7. Afterlife. Lydia Lloyd does not linger in popular memory. She appears instead in records. Names repeated, sentences lengthened, descriptions standardized. Her afterlife is bureaucratic rather than cultural. She becomes an example used by the system to justify itself. This anonymity is itself revealing. Women like Lloyd were not frightening because they were spectacular. They were frightening because they were ordinary. Their crimes blended into the fabric of urban life, emerging from the same conditions that sustained legitimate labor. Lloyd's story endures not as legend, but as pattern. It shows how Victorian justice learned to categorize women whose intelligence expressed itself through movement and adaptation, and how swiftly that categorization closed down the very strategies that had kept them alive. Chapter 8. The Girl in the Neat Boots. She did not look like what the court expected. Minnie Phoebe appeared before the law already misread. Contemporary descriptions lingered on her clothing, her boots in particular, clean, well-kept, unremarkable in a way that unsettled the assumptions of those who encountered her. She did not carry the visible markers of destitution that Victorian justice had learned to associate with female offending. Her respectability was not convincing enough to protect her, but it was convincing enough to confuse. This confusion would not save her. It would, instead, become part of the case against her. Respectability as a fragile shield. In Victorian England, appearance functioned as evidence. Dress, posture, cleanliness, and manner were read as indicators of character, especially for women. Respectability was not simply moral standing. It was a performance that required constant maintenance and expense. For poor women, sustaining that performance demanded calculation. Minnie Phoebe understood this intuitively. She dressed carefully. She presented herself neatly. She moved through public space without drawing attention. In doing so, she did not so much imitate middle-class respectability as borrow its outlines. This borrowing created opportunity. It also created risk. 2. Theft without disorder. The crimes attributed to Phoebe were not violent or chaotic. They were carried out quietly, often in spaces where her presence did not appear anomalous. Shops, lodging houses, and private homes offered moments where trust was assumed and vigilance relaxed. The absence of visible desperation allowed her to pass unremarked. What distinguished Phoebe from other women accused of similar offenses was not method, but perception. She did not look criminal enough to align easily with the charge. This dissonance delayed recognition. It did not prevent it. Once suspicion attached, the same appearance that had offered protection was turned against her. Neatness became disguise. Care became calculation. Respectability became camouflage. 3. Recidivism and the narrowing of possibility. As with Lydia Lloyd, repetition mattered. Phoebe's name began to reappear in records. Charges accumulated. Each appearance narrowed the interpretive space available to her. The court ceased to consider circumstances and focused instead on continuity. At this point, appearance lost its ambiguity. Neat boots no longer suggested effort or dignity. They suggested intent. The court did not ask how such appearance was maintained, or at what cost. It asked only what it concealed. The shift was decisive. Phoebe moved from anomaly to example. 4. Reading the female body in court. The courtroom treated Phoebe's body as text. Her clothing was noted. Her manner was described. Her composure was scrutinized. These observations did not supplement evidence. They replaced it where evidence was thin. The court believed it could read truth from presentation. This reading was deeply unstable. A woman who appeared disordered confirmed expectations. A woman who appeared orderly disrupted them, and disruption itself became suspicious. In this way, Phoebe's intelligence was reframed not as self-preservation but as deceit. The effort required to remain presentable under precarious conditions was interpreted as proof of criminal sophistication. Sentencing and simplification. Sentencing reflected the court's desire to resolve ambiguity. Imprisonment provided clarity where interpretation had failed. It resolved the discomfort created by a woman who refused to look like a warning. The sentence transformed her into one. The law did not punish Minnie Phoebe more harshly than other women convicted of similar crimes. It punished her decisively enough to restore coherence to its own categories. 6. What this case reveals. The Phoebe case reveals the instability of respectability as protection. It shows how appearance could delay suspicion without preventing it, and how the effort required to maintain dignity under poverty could later be recast as manipulation. It exposes a system that relied heavily on visual cues while refusing to acknowledge the labor involved in meeting them. Minnie Phoebe's intelligence lay not in novelty, but in maintenance. She understood that to survive she needed to remain legible as harmless. When that legibility failed, it failed completely. 7. Afterlife. Minnie Phoebe's afterlife is slight. She does not appear prominently in popular memory or later cultural retellings. She survives instead in institutional records, where her neatness is frozen as description and her offenses reduced to pattern. This modest afterlife is telling. Women like Phoebe did not unsettle Victorian society enough to become legends. They unsettled it just enough to require management. Their stories were not sensational, they were instructive. Phoebe endures as a reminder that respectability was never a guarantee, only a delay. For poor women, it offered time rather than safety, and time, in the end, was rarely enough. Chapter 9. The Jewelry Conspiracy. No one woman carried the whole scheme. Rebecca Goldsmith appears in the records not as a solitary figure, but as part of a web. Names cluster around hers: associates, intermediaries, receivers, witnesses. The crime itself is described less as an act than as an arrangement, a set of relationships that allowed valuables to move quietly from respectable hands into illicit circulation. This was not a crime of impulse. It was a crime of coordination. Fraud as collective labor. Victorian fraud is often imagined as solitary deception, a single mind misleading many. The reality was frequently more communal. Fraud on the scale attributed to Goldsmith required shared knowledge and distributed risk. One woman might make introductions. Another might manage correspondence. Another might handle goods. Trust circulated internally even as it was exploited externally. This mattered because it challenged a dominant narrative of female criminality. Women were expected to offend alone, driven by desperation or passion. A conspiracy suggested planning, communication, and division of labor, capacities the court was reluctant to attribute to poor women unless forced. When it was forced, the response was swift. 2. The slum merchant interface. The jewelry at the center of the case did not originate in the slums. It passed through them. Respectable merchants, pawnbrokers, and intermediaries formed a porous boundary between legitimate and illegitimate economies. Goods could be pledged, redeemed, resold, and re-identified. Paperwork conferred legitimacy quickly. Questions followed slowly. Women like Goldsmith operated in this interstitial space. They understood the rhythms of trade, the limits of scrutiny, and the ways respectability could be performed long enough to complete a transaction. They did not need to deceive everyone, only the right person at the right moment. This was intelligence exercised socially rather than individually. It depended on cooperation and discretion rather than bravado. 3. Exposure through association. The conspiracy unraveled not through a single failure, but through connection. Once suspicion attached to one participant, it spread along relational lines. Names reappeared. Addresses overlapped. Testimony intersected. The same faces were recognized in different contexts. What had once looked like coincidence became pattern. In court, this pattern was decisive. Each woman's guilt was reinforced by the presence of the others. Association became evidence. Silence became collusion. Inconsistencies across accounts were framed as proof of coordination rather than confusion. The collective nature of the crime, which had once offered protection, now magnified culpability. 4. The court confronts female organization. The court's discomfort was palpable. It struggled to articulate how women could organize without male direction. The language used oscillated between minimization and alarm. At times, the women were portrayed as tools of unseen men. At others, they were described as ringleaders, corrupting influences, organizers of vice. This instability reflected a deeper anxiety. Organization implied intention sustained over time. It suggested intelligence not in isolation, but in concert. That possibility unsettled a legal culture accustomed to interpreting women's crimes as reactive or individual. In resolving this discomfort, the court emphasized hierarchy. Leaders were identified. Responsibility was concentrated. Complexity was simplified into roles that could be punished. Punishment and dispersal. Sentencing aimed to dismantle the network. Imprisonment removed key participants from circulation. Separation disrupted communication. The state treated the conspiracy as a structure that could be broken apart rather than a symptom that could be understood. This approach was effective in the narrow sense. The specific arrangement collapsed. It did little to address the conditions that had made such arrangements viable. Porous markets, uneven regulation, and women excluded from legitimate enterprise. 6. What this case reveals. The Goldsmith case reveals the capacity for collective intelligence among poor women and the threat it posed to Victorian authority. It shows how cooperation allowed women to mitigate risk, share knowledge, and operate at a scale otherwise unavailable to them. It also shows how quickly that cooperation was reframed as conspiracy once it crossed into illegality. The court's response prioritized control over comprehension. By isolating and punishing individuals, it avoided confronting the broader economic networks that facilitated the crime. In this case, intelligence was not hidden within care or respectability. It was distributed. That distribution made it harder to ignore and easier to fear. 7. Afterlife. Rebecca Goldsmith's afterlife is fragmented. She does not endure as a singular figure in popular memory. Instead, she appears intermittently in records and summaries, her name attached to others, her actions inseparable from the group. This diffusion mirrors the crime itself. The lack of a dominant narrative is instructive. Collective crime resists myth-making. It offers no lone villain, no simple morality. As a result, it is often reduced to footnote or category. What is lost is the recognition that women like Goldsmith were not merely reacting to circumstance. They were organizing within it. Their afterlife fades not because their crimes were insignificant, but because acknowledging their coordination would require a reassessment of how Victorian society understood women's capacity for planning and alliance. The conspiracy dissolves into history, but the conditions that produced it persist, quietly, structurally, and largely unexamined. Chapter 10: Queens of the Hoist. They did not steal alone. The women later known as the 40 elephants did not emerge suddenly, nor did they invent their trade from nothing. They evolved out of the same conditions that shaped every other woman in this book: precarious work, relentless surveillance, and the narrowing of legitimate options. What distinguished them was scale. They organized. By the late Victorian period, shoplifting had become both more tempting and more policed. Department stores expanded, displays became more elaborate, and goods were handled more freely by customers. At the same time, security tightened. Plainclothes detectives watched crowds. Female shop staff were trained to observe behavior. The city learned to expect theft, and the women who practiced it learned to adapt. The 40 elephants did not rely on speed or secrecy alone. They relied on coordination. Theft is work. For the women involved, shoplifting was not recreation or impulse. It was labor. It required planning, timing, physical endurance, and cooperation. Roles were distributed. Some women created distraction. Others moved goods. Others received, concealed, and redistributed. The work was repetitive, physically demanding, and risky. It demanded discipline. This mattered. Victorian discourse struggled to frame such activity as anything other than deviance. Yet in practice, it functioned like an informal occupation, one that paid better than most forms of women's labor and offered a degree of autonomy otherwise unavailable. The women involved did not romanticize the risk. Arrest meant imprisonment. Recognition meant exclusion. Injury and illness were constant threats. But the alternative, respectable labor, offered little security and less dignity. The choice was not between good and bad work. It was between bad work and worse. 2. Female solidarity and suspicion. What made the 40 elephants particularly unsettling to Victorian authorities was not theft itself, but solidarity. Women working together violated expectations. Female crime was supposed to be solitary, driven by desperation or moral weakness. Organization suggested intention, loyalty, and shared purpose. It implied that women could form durable networks independent of male control. This challenged the prevailing social order. The gang structure was fluid rather than rigid. Leadership shifted. Membership changed. Knowledge was shared selectively. New women were trained. The network adapted as policing tactics evolved. This adaptability was read by authorities as cunning and menace. It was, in fact, collective intelligence. 3. The state responds. Policing responded with escalation. Surveillance intensified. Descriptions circulated. Repeat offenders were targeted aggressively. Courts imposed harsher sentences on women identified as organizers or recruiters. Imprisonment was used not only as punishment, but as disruption. The language of proceedings hardened. Women were described as professional thieves, leaders, corrupting influences. The moral panic was clear. Theft had crossed from individual failing into organized challenge. The response was not reform of labor conditions or retail practices. It was containment. 4. Courtroom narratives. In court, the 40 elephants were not tried as workers, but as threats. Testimony emphasized coordination and repeat offending. Association itself became incriminating. A woman's presence alongside known offenders could outweigh evidence of individual acts. Silence was framed as loyalty to criminal peers rather than fear of authority. The court sought to personalize responsibility, even within collective action. Ringleaders were identified. Hierarchies were imposed retrospectively. Complexity was reduced to roles that could be punished decisively. This simplification served legal clarity. It did not serve truth. Intelligence made visible. Unlike earlier cases in this book, the intelligence displayed by the 40 elephants could not be dismissed as incidental. It was visible, shared, and sustained. It required memory, communication, and trust. It functioned over time. It adapted to pressure. This visibility made it intolerable. Victorian society could ignore female intelligence when it appeared as care, endurance, or isolated cunning. It could not ignore intelligence that organized women into an effective economic unit outside sanctioned labor. The response was severe because the implication was destabilizing. That women, denied legitimate opportunity, would create their own systems, and that those systems might work. 6. What this case reveals. The 40 elephants reveal the end point of the trajectory traced throughout this book. Here, intelligence is no longer hidden or apologetic. It is overt, collective, and unapologetic. It rejects respectability as protection and embraces organization as survival. The state's reaction confirms what it feared most. Not theft itself, but the demonstration that women could cooperate strategically in defiance of economic and social constraints. This case exposes the limits of Victorian tolerance. Individual cleverness might be condemned. Collective intelligence had to be dismantled. 7. Afterlife. The afterlife of the 40 elephants is fragmented and uneven. They appear in police files, court records, and later histories as a curiosity, a female gang, an anomaly, a footnote to male-dominated criminal narratives. Individual women are named briefly and then disappear again. The organization itself is treated as exceptional rather than symptomatic. This framing is misleading. The 40 elephants were not an aberration. They were a logical response to a labor market that offered women long hours, low pay, and moral judgment in exchange for survival. Their work was criminal, but their organization was rational. Their afterlife reassures by minimizing them. It presents them as a closed chapter rather than a challenge. It allows Victorian society and later readers to admire their audacity without confronting the conditions that made such audacity necessary. They remain, however, the clearest example in this book of what happens when women denied recognition for their intelligence decide to use it together. With them, the individual lives traced in these chapters converge into a final pattern. Intelligence ignored until it threatens order, and punished most harshly when it proves effective. Part 3. What the records cannot say. Patterns without confession. Victorian court records are confident documents. They speak in verdicts, sentences, and classifications. They arrange lives into charges and outcomes. They present themselves as final. And yet, when read together, the cases in this book expose a series of recurring patterns that the records themselves never fully acknowledge. Women appear repeatedly at moments of rupture. After death, after discovery, after accumulation. They rarely appear at moments of endurance. The record notices failure far more readily than survival. It preserves the instant when a woman becomes legible to the law, not the years she spent navigating invisibility beforehand. Across these cases, intelligence appears in forms the court struggled to recognize as such. It appears as observation, timing, emotional regulation, and social navigation. It appears as cooperation, patience, and administrative fluency. It appears as labor. What the record offers instead is character. Cleverness becomes artfulness. Restraint becomes coldness. Organization becomes conspiracy. These translations are not incidental. They are the means by which the law renders female intelligence punishable. 2. The limits of proof and the urge to conclude. One of the most striking features of Victorian justice is its discomfort with uncertainty. In cases like Adelaide Bartlett's, the court encountered its own limits and retreated. Acquittal did not restore clarity. It merely acknowledged the inability to prove. In other cases, Sarah Chesham's most notably, the same discomfort pushed the court in the opposite direction. Where proof faltered, consensus stepped in. Where science hesitated, reputation filled the gap. This inconsistency is not a failure of individual judges or juries. It reflects a deeper tension between the desire for moral resolution and the reality of partial knowledge. Victorian courts were willing to tolerate uncertainty when it protected existing hierarchies, marriage, respectability, privacy. They were far less tolerant when uncertainty threatened order from below. Poor women who lived publicly, visibly, and without deference were less likely to benefit from doubt. The record does not say this directly. It does not need to. The pattern is enough. 3. Violence, labor, and legibility. The crimes examined in this book vary widely in severity and consequence. Some resulted in death. Others resulted in loss, humiliation, or imprisonment. What unites them is not harm alone, but the conditions under which harm became visible. Violence that occurred within accepted roles, caregiving, marriage, domestic labor, remained unseen for longer. Fraud that exploited aspiration rather than desperation persisted quietly. Theft that blended into ordinary movement avoided notice until repetition forced attention. The law did not discover these crimes, because it understood women's lives. It discovered them when accumulation made ignorance untenable. This delay matters. It reveals a system reactive rather than preventative, more invested in classification than comprehension. Women's labor, whether caring, cleaning, beautifying, or organizing, was largely unregulated and undervalued. Only when that labor intersected with illegality did the state intervene. By then, the intervention was often brutal. 4. Intelligence without permission. At no point does Victorian justice deny that the women in these cases were intelligent. What it denies is their right to that intelligence. Again and again, the record expresses surprise. Surprise that a woman could plan. Surprise that she could deceive. Surprise that she could organize others. This surprise is not naive. It is ideological. It reflects a belief that intelligence in women, particularly poor women, should be passive, domestic, and invisible. When intelligence appeared outside those bounds, it required explanation. That explanation was almost always moral. The record cannot say this openly, but it enacts it consistently. Women were permitted cleverness only when it served others. When it served themselves, it became suspect. When it succeeded collectively, it became intolerable. What remains unsaid. There are silences in the record that no amount of careful reading can fill. We do not know what Adelaide Bartlett thought when she left the courtroom. We do not know how Mary and Cotton understood her own actions. We do not know what Sarah Chesham feared most. We do not know what Lydia Lloyd hoped for beyond survival. The record is uninterested in interiority unless it can be used to establish motive. Emotion appears only when it can be weighed. Thought appears only when it can be condemned. This absence is not accidental. Victorian justice was not designed to preserve women's inner lives. It was designed to manage bodies, behaviors, and outcomes. To acknowledge this limitation is not to abandon history. It is to practice it honestly. 6. Reading against the grain. The task of this book has not been to resolve every case or rehabilitate every reputation. It has been to read the record against itself, to notice what it emphasizes, what it repeats, and what it avoids, to trace patterns across cases rather than isolate them, to treat intelligence not as anomaly but as response. When read this way, the women in this book do not appear as aberrations. They appear as products of a system that demanded ingenuity while denying its existence. They appear as individuals navigating constraints that offered few legitimate rewards for intelligence and severe punishment for its misdirection. The record cannot say this plainly, but it shows it again and again. 7. The final accounting. Victorian justice claimed authority over women's lives without fully understanding them. It punished decisively where certainty was available, and sometimes where it was not. It condemned intelligence when it disrupted order, and ignored it when it sustained life quietly. It preserved its own coherence even as it failed to provide protection. The women in this book were not heroic. They were not uniformly guilty or innocent. They were capable, constrained, and observed, often poorly, sometimes viciously. Their stories endure not because they are extraordinary, but because they expose something ordinary and unresolved. The cost of disregarding intelligence until it becomes a problem, and the violence that follows when a system is forced to confront what it has long refused to see. That is what the records cannot say. And that is why they must be read anyway. Conclusion. Intelligence, judgment, and the refusal to see. Victorian courts believed themselves to be observant institutions. They listened, recorded, weighed, and decided. They produced an archive vast enough to give the impression of completeness. And yet, across the lives examined in this book, a persistent failure remains visible. A failure to recognize intelligence until it demanded punishment. The women whose stories appear here were not exceptional because they offended. They were exceptional because they were noticed. Before arrest, before trial, before judgment, most of them lived lives shaped by constant calculation. They read people carefully. They learned how institutions behaved. They understood which forms of speech were rewarded and which were punished. They adapted, endured, concealed, and cooperated. This intelligence was neither accidental nor ornamental. It was required. What Victorian justice could not do, what it resisted doing, was to acknowledge that such intelligence existed as a normal feature of poor women's lives. When it appeared quietly, sustaining households and managing scarcity, it was ignored. When it appeared visibly, enabling harm or organization, it was condemned as unnatural. This distinction mattered. It allowed the law to preserve a fiction, that intelligence belonged naturally to authority and appeared in women only as deviation. In maintaining that fiction, the court protected its own coherence at the expense of comprehension. The result was a legal culture that repeatedly mistook behavior for character, reputation for proof, and survival strategies for moral failure. In some cases, this produced decisive justice. In others, it produced doubt disguised as certainty. In all cases, it narrowed the range of stories that could be told about women's lives. This book has not attempted to correct the record by replacing condemnation with sympathy or judgment with apology. It has attempted something more modest and more difficult: to take the record seriously without treating it as complete. When read closely, Victorian court proceedings do not simply document crime. They document fear of women who did not conform, fear of intelligence that could not be controlled, fear of cooperation where obedience was expected. They show a system more comfortable punishing than understanding, more adept at classification than care. The women in these chapters were not alike. Some harmed deliberately, some may have been misjudged. Some worked alone, others worked together. What unites them is not moral equivalence, but legibility. Each became visible to the law only when she could be framed as a problem. That framing has endured. Modern retellings often reproduce the same simplifications, celebrating ingenuity as spectacle or condemning it as monstrosity. What is lost, again, is context. What is lost is the recognition that intelligence exercised under constraint will rarely look virtuous, and that systems which disregard it until it offends will always claim surprise when it does. The Victorian courts could not say this. They could not afford to. Their authority depended on the belief that they saw clearly. The record they left behind tells a more complicated story. To read it honestly is not to excuse harm. It is to understand how harm was interpreted, narrated, and punished, and how much intelligence had to be ignored before it could finally be seen. That is the work this book has attempted.